They buried her at sunrise, and by sunset, she was knocking on his door. The wind carried the last of the red dust across Ethan Cole's boots as he stood over the shallow grave just beyond the ridge, 20 yards from the crooked fence line that marked the edge of town, the kind of place where people put things they didn't want remembered, the kind of place where names faded faster than wood. He hadn't come looking for trouble, just a stray calf and a quiet afternoon, but the earth there was too fresh, too soft, and the silence around it felt wrong, like even the birds had agreed to stay away. So he dug, slow at first, then faster, the way a man does when something in his chest starts pulling harder than reason, until the shovel struck something that didn't belong to the ground. Not bone, not stone, something lighter, wrapped in cloth that hadn't had time to rot. He knelt, brushing away the dirt with bare hands, feeling the cool grit under his nails, and when he unwrapped it, the sunlight caught silver, a necklace, simple but deliberate, etched with markings he didn't need to understand to know they meant something more than decoration. It wasn't the kind of thing you buried by accident. It wasn't the kind of thing you left behind. And yet there it was, lying where a body should have been, quiet as a lie that had already done its work. Someone had told him earlier that morning, over weak coffee and quieter voices, that the Apache girl had been found and buried before dawn, that it was better that way, cleaner, that not every story needed to linger. He hadn't argued. Men like Ethan didn't argue with towns that had already made up their minds. But now, holding that necklace, feeling its weight settle into his palm like a question, he understood something didn't line up. Graves were supposed to hold answers, not remove them. He stood there a long moment, the horizon stretching wide and empty, the kind of emptiness that made a man feel small, then slipped the necklace into his coat pocket, not out of greed, not even out of curiosity, but because leaving it there felt like agreeing to something he didn't yet understand. By the time the sun began to fall, painting the sky in that slow, burning gold that made everything look softer than it really was, Ethan had put the shovel back where he found it and told himself he'd forget the whole thing, that some questions belonged to the dirt. His cabin sat a mile out, alone, the way he liked it, with nothing but open land and the occasional wind to keep him company. And as he stepped onto the porch, the wood creaking under his weight, he felt that same unease settle in again, quiet but persistent, like a song he couldn't quite place. He poured water into a tin cup, let it sit in his hands a moment, then drank, eyes drifting toward the fading light, toward the road that no one used unless they had a reason. That was when he heard it, not loud, not urgent, just the soft, steady sound of footsteps on dry ground, close enough to belong to someone who knew exactly where they were going. He set the cup down without thinking, his hand hovering near the doorframe, not reaching for anything, just waiting, because whatever was coming didn't feel like something you could stop with a weapon. The figure appeared at the edge of the yard, moving out of the last of the light, and for a second, the world seemed to hold its breath. She walked like she wasn't afraid of the dark, like she'd already made peace with it, her posture straight despite the long road behind her, her eyes fixed on him in a way that didn't ask for permission. Ayanna Redbird. He knew her name before she spoke it, knew it the same way everyone in town did, spoken in half-whispers and sideways glances, a name people used when they wanted to explain things they didn't understand. She stopped a few feet from the porch, close enough that he could see the dust along the hem of her dress, the way her hair caught the last light, the calm in her expression that didn't match the story he'd heard that morning. And then he saw it. The necklace, resting against her collarbone, silver catching the evening glow, the same markings, the same weight, the same impossible presence as the one sitting in his pocket. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The wind shifted, carrying the faint scent of dry grass and distant smoke, and Ethan felt something inside him. Tighten, not fear, not exactly, but the sharp awareness that whatever line he thought separated the living from the dead had just been crossed without so much as a sound. She looked at him, steady, unflinching, as if she could see the question already forming in his mind, as if she'd been waiting for it. When she finally spoke, her voice was low, even, carrying none of the urgency he expected, only a quiet certainty that made the air feel heavier. "You dug where you shouldn't," she said. And Ethan, standing there with the weight of the same necklace pressing against his chest from the inside of his coat, realized that whatever he had found in that grave, it wasn't meant to stay buried. And whatever stood in front of him now, it wasn't something the town had ever truly put to rest. The porch boards creaked once under Ethan Cole's shifting weight, then went still, as if even the wood understood this was not a moment for noise, not a moment for anything that might break whatever fragile line existed between what he knew and what stood in front of him. And he realized he had not yet taken his hand out of his coat pocket, his fingers still curled around the cold silver he had pulled from the earth only hours before, the edges of the necklace pressing into his skin like it was, reminding him that it had been somewhere else first, somewhere it did not belong anymore. And yet here it was again, resting against her collarbone as if it had never left. Ayanna did not move closer, did not step back. She simply stood there in the fading light, the last of the sun tracing the lines of her face, her expression unreadable in a way that felt older than either of them. And for a moment Ethan wondered if the stories the town told about her were not lies exactly, just incomplete, the kind of truths people shape into something easier to carry. He let out a slow breath, the kind a man takes when he knows the next words matter more than they should, and finally spoke, his voice lower than usual, like he did not want it traveling too far across the open land. "I found it buried," he said, not accusing, not questioning, just placing the fact between them the way a man might lay down a card he did not fully understand. Her eyes flicked once, briefly, to his coat, not enough for anyone else to notice, but enough for him to feel seen in a way that made the back of his neck tighten. Then she looked back at him, steady again, as if she had already accounted for that detail long before she stepped onto his land. "Then you found what they wanted hidden," she replied, her voice carrying that same quiet weight, not raised, not urgent, just certain, and that certainty unsettled him more than any threat could have, because it left no room for doubt, no space for him to pretend this was coincidence or mistake. The wind shifted again, brushing past them, lifting a strand of her hair, and Ethan became aware of how still everything else was. No horses moving, no distant voices from town, just the two of them and a question that seemed to stretch wider than the land itself. He pulled his hand from his pocket slowly, not dramatic, not cautious, just deliberate, and opened his palm enough for the silver to catch what little light remained, the second necklace, identical in every way, resting there like a mirror that refused to reflect properly. For the first time, something changed in her expression, not fear, not surprise, but something quieter, something like recognition meeting confirmation, as if she had been waiting for him to make that exact move. "There is only one," she said softly, her gaze shifting between the one in his hand and the one at her throat, and the words hung there, simple and impossible at the same time, because Ethan could see both, could feel one and see the other, and neither looked less real than the other. He closed his fingers around it again, slower this time, his mind working through the kind of problem that did not have the right shape for logic, because this was not about things being lost or found. This was about something being changed, moved, rewritten in a way that left traces behind if you knew where to look. "That grave," he said, glancing back toward the dark outline of the ridge. There was no body. The statement landed between them, heavier than before, and for a moment she said nothing, her eyes drifting past him, toward the direction of town, where faint lights had begun to appear in windows, small and distant, like they belonged to another world entirely. "There was not meant to be," she answered after a while, and there was something in her tone now, something deeper, something that carried the weight of more than just the present moment, and Ethan felt the pieces begin to shift in his mind, not into clarity, but into a pattern that suggested this was never about a death, not the kind the town had spoken about anyway. He leaned slightly against the porch post, grounding himself in the rough wood, the familiar texture a small anchor in a moment that felt like it was trying to drift somewhere else entirely. "They said you were buried this morning," he continued, watching her carefully now, not like a man looking for danger, but like one trying to understand a story that had been told wrong from the start. Ayanna let out a breath that almost sounded like a laugh, though there was no humor in it, only a quiet acknowledgement of something expected. "They buried a name," she said, her hand lifting briefly to touch the necklace at her throat, her fingers resting against it with a familiarity that spoke of years, not hours, not a person. The words settled into him slowly, each one finding its place with a weight that made the air feel heavier, and Ethan realized that whatever had been placed in that shallow grave was not meant to mark an ending, but to create one, to close something that was not supposed to remain open. He looked at her again, really looked this time, at the steadiness in her posture, the absence of fear in her eyes, the quiet strength that did not ask for recognition, and it occurred to him that she was not standing there like someone who had returned from anything, but like someone who had never left, someone who had simply been told she no longer existed. The night had begun to settle in fully now, the last light gone from the horizon, and the distance between his cabin and the town felt wider than ever, like whatever was happening here belonged outside of the lines most people lived within. Then why bury it at all? He asked, not because he expected a simple answer, but because the question itself felt necessary, like the first step towards something he was not yet ready to see. Ayana lowered her hand from the necklace, her gaze steady on him once more, and in that quiet space between them, with the wind moving slow and the world holding still, she answered in a voice that carried no anger, no fear, only truth. Because it is easier to take land from the dead, she said, and for the first time that evening, Ethan felt the full weight of what he had uncovered begin to settle into something real, something that did not belong to mystery anymore, but to people, to choices, to a silence that had been carefully built and was now, piece by piece, starting to come undone. By the time the first lanterns lit up along the main street, Ethan Cole was already riding into town, the rhythm of his horse steady beneath him, each step measured like he was trying to keep his thoughts from getting ahead of themselves. But it was no use, because the moment Ayana had spoken those words, something had shifted, not just in the story he had been told, but in the way the whole place felt, like the ground itself had been keeping a secret and he had just brushed against the edge of it. The town of Red Hollow did not look like a place that hid things well, not at first glance, with its crooked storefronts, its dust-covered windows, its people who watched everything and said little. But Ethan knew better, because places like this did not survive by telling the truth. They survived by agreeing on which parts to ignore. He tied his horse outside the general store, the same post he had used 100 times before, and stepped down, boots hitting the dirt with a dull sound that seemed louder than usual, as if the quiet around him had grown heavier since morning. A few men stood near the saloon doors, their voices low, their eyes drifting toward him just long enough to register his presence before sliding away again. Not unfriendly, but not open either, the kind of look people gave when they sensed something had changed but had not yet decided what it meant. Inside, the air smelled of wood, coffee, and the faint trace of tobacco that never really left, and behind the counter stood Mr. Halvorson, wiping the same glass he had probably been wiping for the past 10 minutes, his movements slow, deliberate, like he was giving himself time to think before speaking. "You are out late, Ethan," he said without looking up, his voice even, but there was something beneath it, something that suggested he already knew more than he was saying. Ethan walked to the counter, resting his hands on the worn wood, feeling the grooves left by years of other men doing the same. And for a moment, he considered saying nothing, letting the night pass like any other, but the weight in his coat pocket reminded him that silence was no longer something he could afford. "They buried her this morning," he said, keeping his tone neutral, watching for any shift in the old man's face. The cloth paused for half a second, just enough to matter, before continuing its slow circle. "That is what was decided," Halvorson replied, and there it was, not a confirmation, not a denial, just a statement that carried more agreement than truth. Ethan reached into his pocket and placed the necklace on the counter, letting it rest there between them, the silver catching the lamplight in a way that made it impossible to ignore. The old man's hand stopped completely this time, the glass still in his grip, and when he finally looked up, his eyes settled on the necklace with a quiet recognition that felt older than the town itself. "Where did you get that?" he asked, but the question lacked surprise, like he already knew the answer and was asking anyway, because that was how things were done here. "In a grave that was not holding a body," Ethan said, and the words seemed to settle into the room, drawing the attention of a couple of men near the door, their conversation fading into silence as they listened without turning their heads. Halvorson set the glass down slowly, his fingers lingering on the edge of the counter, and for a long moment he said nothing, just looking at the necklace like it might explain itself if given enough time. "Some things are not meant to be dug up," he said finally, not as a warning, not quite, but as a reminder of the kind that came from experience rather than fear. Ethan leaned in slightly, his voice lowering just enough that it would not carry. Beyond the counter. She is not dead, he said, and this time there was no way to soften it, no way to make it fit into the version of events the town had already accepted. The reaction was not loud, not dramatic, but it was there, in the way the men by the door shifted their weight, in the way one of them exhaled slowly through his nose, like he had been holding his breath longer than he realized. Halvorson's eyes lifted from the necklace to Ethan's face, searching, measuring, and for the first time there was something like concern in them, not for himself, not even for Ethan, but for something larger, something that stretched beyond the walls of the store. You saw her, he said quietly, and it was not a question. Ethan nodded once. She came to my place, he replied, and he did not need to say more, because the silence that followed filled in the rest. The image of a girl who was supposed to be gone standing in the doorway of a man who had no reason to lie. The old man sighed, the sound heavy, like it carried years with it, and he reached out, not to take the necklace, but to turn it slightly, revealing the markings more clearly under the light. That piece does not belong to the town, he said, his voice softer now, almost careful, and neither does the name they put in that ground. Ethan watched him, the pieces aligning just enough to form a direction, if not a full picture. Then whose name was it? He asked, and Halvorson's gaze flicked toward the window, toward the dark stretch of land beyond the buildings, before returning to the necklace. A name that made things inconvenient, he said, choosing his words like each one had weight. A name that made certain claims harder to justify. The meaning settled in slowly, like dust after a long ride, and Ethan felt that same tightening in his chest again, not from confusion this time, but from understanding, the kind that did not bring comfort, only clarity. So they buried it, he said, more to himself than to the old man, and Halvorson gave a small nod, the kind that acknowledged a truth without endorsing it. It is easier that way, he replied, and around them, the town continued its quiet rhythm, lanterns flickering, voices low, as if nothing had changed at all, and yet Ethan knew that somewhere between that shallow grave and the girl who stood in his yard, something had already begun to shift, something that would not stay buried no matter how much dirt they piled on top of it. The night had settled deeper by the time Ethan Cole stepped back out onto the street, the lamplight behind him fading as the door closed with a soft wooden thud, and for a moment he stood there without moving, letting the quiet wrap around him, listening to the distant murmur of voices that never quite rose above a certain level in this town, as if everyone understood that saying too much carried a cost they were not willing to pay. He slipped the necklace back into his coat, but this time it felt different, heavier, not because it had changed, but because because now it was no longer just something he had found. It was something that had been placed into his hands by a truth that refused to stay buried. The sheriff's office sat at the far end of the street, its single lantern burning steady above the door, a small square of light against the growing dark, and Ethan found himself walking toward it without fully deciding to, his boots carrying him across the packed dirt with a slow, even rhythm that matched the way his thoughts had begun to settle into something sharper, something more defined. Sheriff Dalton Briggs was not a man people feared, not in the way stories liked to tell it, but he was a man people listened to, which in a place like Red Hollow meant he held a different kind of power, the kind that did not need to raise its voice to be obeyed. Ethan paused just short of the steps, glancing once toward the rest of the town, where a few figures still lingered in doorways and along the edges of buildings, their silhouettes barely moving, watching without appearing to watch, and it struck him that this was how things stayed the way they were, not through force, but through a kind of shared agreement to look the other way. He stepped up onto the porch and pushed the door open, the hinges giving a low, familiar groan, and inside, Briggs sat behind his desk, hat resting. Beside him, a ledger open under the lamplight, his pen moving slowly across the page as if nothing in the world had changed since morning. Evening, Ethan, the sheriff said without looking up, his voice calm, steady, the kind of voice that did not invite interruption. Ethan closed the door behind him, the sound soft but final, and walked a few steps forward, stopping just enough distance from the desk to keep the air between them clear. I went out past the ridge today, he said, keeping his tone even, matching the sheriff's rhythm, because anything else would feel like pushing against something that had not yet revealed its edge. Briggs nodded slightly, still writing, as if that information fit neatly into whatever line he was already drawing. "Cattle stray that way sometimes," he replied, and there was nothing false in the words, nothing that could be argued, which made them harder to push against. Ethan let a second pass, then reached into his coat and set the necklace on the desk, placing it gently on the open page, the silver interrupting the neat lines of ink like a truth that did not belong in the record. The pen stopped. Not abruptly, not dramatically, just enough to mark the moment. Briggs lifted his eyes slowly, taking in the necklace first, then Ethan, and in that quiet exchange, something unspoken passed between them, something that did not need to be named to be understood. "That should not be in your possession," the sheriff said after a moment, his voice unchanged, but the weight behind it had shifted just slightly, like a door that had been nudged open a fraction. Ethan rested his hands lightly on the edge of the desk, not leaning in, not backing away, holding his ground in the simplest way a man could. "It was not in the ground for long," he replied, and the words carried more than their surface meaning, enough that Briggs's gaze sharpened, just a touch. The sheriff closed the ledger slowly, his hand resting on top of it, covering the interrupted lines as if they could be hidden again by something as simple as a palm. "You are digging into matters that have already been settled," he said, and there it was, the same language Ethan had heard in a dozen different forms, the kind that turned decisions into facts and facts into something untouchable. Ethan did not move, did not raise his voice, but he felt that quiet line inside him hold firm. "There was no body," he said, letting the statement sit in the room, letting it take its place where it could not be easily dismissed. Briggs looked at him for a long second, longer than before, and for the first time there was something like hesitation in his eyes, not doubt exactly, but the awareness that the conversation had stepped outside the boundaries he preferred. "You are mistaken," the sheriff said, but the words did not carry the same certainty they might have earlier that day. Ethan shook his head once, slow, deliberate. "She came to my cabin," he said, and the silence that followed was different now, heavier, filled with something that could not be written into a ledger or dismissed with a simple reply. The sheriff's gaze dropped briefly to the necklace, then back to Ethan, and in that moment, the calm surface he had maintained began to show the faintest crack, not enough for most to notice, but enough for a man who had spent years reading what people did not say. "Then you should forget what you think you saw," Briggs said quietly, and there was no threat in it, no raised voice, just a suggestion that carried the weight of expectation, the kind that had kept this town steady for years. Ethan looked at the necklace, then back at the sheriff, and something in his expression settled into place, not defiance, not anger, just a quiet decision that did not need to be spoken out loud. "I do not think I saw her," he said, his voice low, steady. "I know I did." The words hung there, simple and unyielding, and for a moment, neither man moved. The space between them filled with the understanding that whatever had been buried that morning had not stayed where it was meant to, and no amount of quiet agreement was going to put it back. The air inside the sheriff's office did not change when Ethan Cole stepped back, but something in the space between him and Dalton Briggs had shifted into a place that could not easily return to what it was before, and Ethan understood then that whatever quiet agreement had held this town together was not built on truth, but on timing, on who chose to speak and who chose to stay silent, and more importantly, when. He reached out and took the necklace from the desk, not hurried, not hesitant, just steady, and as the silver left the lamplight and disappeared back into his coat, it felt less like he was putting something away and more like he was carrying something forward. The sheriff did not stop him, did not reach out, did not even look surprised, which told Ethan more than any reaction could have, because men like Briggs only stayed still when they believed movement would cost them more than silence. "You should go home, Ethan," the sheriff said after a moment, his voice returning to that same calm tone, the one that suggested the conversation had ended whether or not anything had been resolved. "Get some rest, let the night pass." It sounded reasonable, the kind of advice that fit neatly into the life Ethan had been living for years, a life where a man kept his head down and his questions to himself, but it no longer fit the shape of what he had seen. Ethan nodded once, not in agreement, but in acknowledgement, then turned and walked toward the door, each step measured, each movement deliberate, as if he was already aware that every action from this point forward would be remembered differently than the ones that came before. Outside, the night had settled fully, the sky stretched wide and dark above the town, the stars sharp and distant, the kind that reminded a man how small his world really was, and yet how heavy it could feel when something inside it refused to stay in place. A few figures still lingered along the street, their conversations quiet, their eyes following him in that subtle way people used when they did not want to be seen watching, and Ethan did not look back at them, did not slow, did not change his path, because he understood now that whatever had been buried that morning had not just been a name, it had been a boundary, and he had already stepped across it. He untied his horse and mounted in one smooth motion, the leather creaking softly beneath him, then turned toward the road that led back to his cabin, the 1-mile stretch of open land that had always felt like distance and now felt like something else. Entirely, like a space where truth could exist without being shaped by too many voices. The ride back was quiet, the hooves steady against the packed earth, the wind brushing past him in slow, even waves, and with each yard, Ethan felt the pieces of what he had learned begin to settle into something clearer, not complete, not yet, but enough to form a direction. They had buried a name, not because it was true, but because it was useful. And now that name was standing in his doorway, breathing, speaking, refusing to disappear. When the outline of his cabin came into view, a faint silhouette against the darker line of the horizon, he saw immediately that he was not alone. The small lantern by the porch casting a soft glow that outlined a figure sitting on the steps, still as the land around it. Ayana had not moved far. She sat with her hands resting loosely in her lap, her posture straight, her gaze lifted toward the open sky, as if she had been watching something beyond what most people noticed. And when Ethan rode closer, she did not turn right away, did not acknowledge him until he had dismounted and stepped onto the porch, the boards giving that same quiet creak under his boots. "You went to him," she said without looking at him, her voice calm, not questioning, not accusing, just stating something she already knew. And Ethan realized that for her, this was not about guessing. It was about understanding how people moved when faced with something they could not ignore. "I did," he replied, standing a few feet away, giving her space not out of caution, but out of respect, the kind that came naturally when a man recognized he was standing in the presence of something that had been forced into silence for too long. She nodded slightly, her eyes still on the sky, as if whatever answer he might have brought back had already been accounted for in her mind. "And he told you to forget," she said, and there was no bitterness in it, only a quiet familiarity, like she had heard those words in different forms more times than she could count. Ethan leaned lightly against the post, the rough wood steady against his shoulder, and for a moment he did not answer, because the truth was not in what the sheriff had said, it was in what he had not denied. "He told me it was settled," Ethan said finally, and the word hung there between them, heavier now, stripped of its false comfort. Ayana lowered her gaze from the sky then, turning her head just enough to look at him, and in the soft lantern light, her expression was clear, not hardened, not broken, just certain. "Settled for who?" she asked quietly, and the question did not demand an answer, because it already contained one. Ethan let out a slow breath, the weight of it leaving his chest but not his mind. And he understood then that this was not a matter of uncovering something hidden. It was a matter of choosing whether to let it remain the way it had been arranged. He reached into his coat again and pulled out the necklace, holding it in his hand, the silver catching the faint light, and for the first time since he had found it, he did not see it as an object, but as something that connected two versions of the same story, one buried, one standing in front of him. "They used your name," he said, looking at her, not past her, not around her, but directly at her, to make something easier for them. Ayana's eyes did not waver, did not soften, did not harden either. They simply held his, steady and unafraid, and when she spoke, her voice carried that same quiet truth that had followed her from the moment she stepped out of the dark. "They did not just use it," she said, her fingers lifting to touch the necklace at her throat. "They tried to end it." The wind moved again, gentle, steady, carrying the scent of dry earth and distant sage, and in that stillness, with the night wrapped around them, and the town a mile away pretending nothing had changed, Ethan realized that what he was holding was not just proof of something wrong. It was the beginning of something that could no longer be ignored, not by him, not by her, and not for much longer by anyone else. The night stretched long and quiet around the cabin, the kind of quiet that did not soothe but listened, and Ethan Cole stood there with the weight of the silver in his hand, realizing that for the first time in years. He was not alone in his silence, because the truth sitting across from him had its own voice, steady and unafraid, and it was not asking for permission to be heard. He moved to the edge of the porch and sat down on the top step, the wood warm from the day's heat, but cooling fast under the night air, placing the necklace between his palms like it was something that needed to be understood before it could be returned to where it belonged. Ayanna watched him for a moment, then shifted slightly, turning her body toward him, not closing the distance, but not holding it either, as if the space between them was something both of them were choosing, not something forced upon them. "Tell me," Ethan said after a while, his voice low, not pressing, not demanding, just opening the door to something that had already begun. What did they try to end? The question settled gently, but it carried weight, and Ayanna lowered her gaze for a brief moment, her fingers brushing the edge of the necklace at her throat before she spoke, not hesitating, not searching for words, but choosing them carefully, like each one mattered. "My name is not the one they buried," she said, and the words came without anger, without bitterness, just truth, the kind that had been held too long to need force behind it. Ethan leaned forward slightly, resting his forearms on his knees, listening the way a man listens when he knows the next few words might change the shape of everything that came before. "The one they buried was easier for them," she continued, her voice steady, "because it did not carry the same claim, the same memory, the same right to stand where I stand." The wind moved through the open land again, soft, steady, and Ethan felt something settle into place, not completely, but enough to begin to see the outline of what had been done. "You had a different name," he said quietly, not as a question, but as a piece of the truth taking form. Ayanna nodded once, her eyes lifting to meet his, and in that look, there was something deeper than identity, something tied to land, to history, to something that could not be written down and signed away without leaving marks behind. "I was born Ayanna Redbird of the Southern Ridge," she said, her voice carrying a quiet strength that did not need to be raised, "and that name is tied to the land your town now calls its own." The words lingered, and Ethan felt the weight of them expand beyond the porch, beyond the mile of open ground between his cabin and the town, reaching into the very shape of the place he had been living in without ever questioning how it came to be what it was. "So they changed it," he said, the pieces moving faster now, aligning into something that made sense in a way that did not feel right. "They said you were someone else." Ayanna gave a small nod, her expression unchanged, but her eyes carrying something heavier now, not pain exactly, but the memory of it. "They gave me a name that had no claim," she said, "a name that could disappear without leaving anything behind." Ethan looked down at the necklace in his hands, turning it slightly, the silver catching the faint lantern light, and for the first time, he noticed something he had missed before, a second layer beneath the surface markings, faint, almost worn away, but still there if you looked close enough, like something that had been covered but not completely erased. "There are two markings," he said, more to himself than to her, tracing the edge with his thumb. Ayanna leaned slightly closer, just enough to see what he was seeing, and for a moment, something in her expression shifted, not surprise, but recognition meeting confirmation once again. "The first is mine," she said softly, "the one they tried to remove." Ethan's breath slowed, his mind settling into a clarity that felt sharper than anything he had known in a long time. "And the second?" he asked, already knowing the answer before she spoke it. "The second is the name they buried," she replied, her voice quiet, steady. "The one they wanted everyone to remember instead." The porch creaked faintly as Ethan shifted his weight, the sound grounding him in the present as the truth stretched out in front of him, no longer hidden, no longer uncertain, just waiting for what came next. "They needed you gone," he said, lifting his eyes to hers, not accusing, not questioning, just acknowledging what had been done. Ayanna did not deny it, did not soften it. She simply nodded once. "Not gone." she said, correcting him gently. Forgotten. The difference settled into him deeper than he expected, because being gone left a space, but being forgotten erased the reason that space ever existed. And Ethan understood then that what had been buried that morning was not meant to mark an ending. It was meant to rewrite the beginning. He closed his hand around the necklace again, the silver pressing into his palm, solid, real, undeniable, and for the first time since he had uncovered it, he knew exactly what it was, not just a piece of metal, not just a symbol, but a truth that had survived being buried, being renamed, being nearly erased, and was now sitting between two people who understood what it meant. The wind moved once more across the open land, carrying the quiet of the night with it, and Ethan looked out toward the dark outline of the town, the place that had chosen its version of the story and settled into it like it would never need to change. And he realized that the story was already shifting, not loudly, not all at once, but in small, undeniable ways, starting right here, on a porch that had never held anything more complicated than a man and his solitude, until now. The night did not feel as long anymore, but it felt heavier, as if the land itself had started listening to something it had ignored for too many years. And Ethan Cole remained seated on the porch with the necklace in his hand, turning it slowly between his fingers, not because he needed to see it again, but because it gave his thoughts something steady to follow while everything else shifted. Ayanna sat across from him, quiet, composed, her presence no longer strange, no longer uncertain, but grounded in a way that made the truth feel less like a discovery and more like something that had always been there, waiting for someone to stop looking away. They will not change their story, Ethan said after a while, his voice calm, not cynical, just aware, the kind of awareness that came from years of watching how things stayed the same even when they should not. Ayanna did not respond right away, her gaze drifting toward the dark stretch of land between the cabin and the town, and for a moment it seemed like she was measuring something. Beyond distance, something tied to memory and time rather than miles. I am not asking them to, she said finally, her tone steady, almost gentle, and that caught Ethan's attention more than any defiance would have, because there was no fight in her words, no demand for justice the way he had expected. He leaned back slightly, resting his shoulders against the porch post, studying her with a quiet curiosity that had replaced his earlier doubt. Then what are you asking? He said, and the question was simple, but it carried everything that had led to this moment. Ayanna turned her head, meeting his eyes, and in that look, there was something clear, something unburdened by fear or anger, something that felt stronger than either. Nothing, she said, and the words settled into the space between them with a calm that did not need explanation. I am not asking for anything. Ethan frowned slightly, not in confusion, but in the way a man does when the answer he receives does not match the shape of the question he thought he asked. Then why come here? He said, glancing briefly at the necklace, then back at her. Why not stay gone? Let them believe what they want. Ayanna's expression did not change, but there was a quiet shift in her posture, a subtle straightening, as if the question itself had weight that needed to be met properly. Because I am not gone, she said, her voice low but firm, and I will not live as someone they invented just to make things easier. The words were not loud, not forceful, but they carried a certainty that did not leave room for argument, and Ethan felt something in his chest settle in response, not agreement exactly, but recognition. He looked down at the necklace again, at the faint lines beneath the newer carving, the truth that had been covered but not erased, and he realized that this was not about proving anything to the town. It was about refusing to disappear for the sake of their comfort. They will not like it, he said after a moment, not as a warning, but as a simple fact, the kind that had shaped more than one life in a place like this. Ayanna gave a small nod, acknowledging the truth without being moved by it. They already do not, she replied, and there was no bitterness in her voice, only a quiet understanding that had long since settled into acceptance. The wind shifted again, carrying a faint chill now as the night deepened, and Ethan rubbed his thumb along the edge of the silver, feeling the worn groove where the original marking had been partially removed. You said your name is tied to the land, he said, lifting his eyes to hers again. What happens if they hear it from you? Ayanna held his gaze, steady, unflinching, and for a moment, the silence stretched between them, not empty, but full of something that did not need to be rushed. "Then they will remember," she said quietly, and the simplicity of it struck Ethan harder than anything else she had said, because remembering was not something the town had forgotten how to do. It was something they had chosen not to. He let out a slow breath, leaning forward again, his elbows resting on his knees, the necklace hanging loosely from his hand now, no longer something he held tightly, but something he understood. "And if they refuse?" he asked, not because he doubted her, but because he needed to understand the shape of what she was choosing. Ayana's gaze drifted past him again, toward the distant outline of the town, the faint glow of lanterns barely visible against the dark, and when she spoke, her voice carried that same quiet certainty, unchanged. "Then it does not matter," she said, and there was no defiance in it, no challenge, just truth, "because I will still know it." The words settled deep, deeper than Ethan expected, because they did not rely on anyone else, did not require agreement or approval. They simply existed, the way the land existed, the way the wind moved whether anyone noticed it or not. He sat there for a long moment, letting that sink in, letting the simplicity of it reshape the way he had been thinking about everything that had happened since morning. This was not about changing the town. It was not about forcing truth into a place that had decided to live without it. It was about standing in that truth anyway, even if no one else chose to see it. Ethan looked at her again, really looked this time, not as a mystery, not as a problem to be solved, but as a person who had been told she no longer existed and had simply refused to accept it. And something in that quiet defiance, that calm refusal, felt stronger than anything he had ever seen in a gunfight or a shouted argument. He closed his hand around the necklace one last time, then held it out toward her, not as a return, but as a recognition, as if he was handing back something that had never truly been his to carry. "Then you should not hide it," he said, his voice steady, matching hers now. "Not from them, and not from yourself." Ayana looked at the necklace in his hand, then at him, and for the first time since she had arrived, there was the faintest hint of something softer in her expression, not relief, not gratitude, but something close, something that acknowledged the moment without needing to name it. She reached out and took the necklace, her fingers brushing his briefly, and when she placed it back against her throat, adjusting it so both markings caught the faint light, it no longer looked like something that had been altered, it looked like something that had endured, and in that quiet, steady gesture, Ethan understood that whatever came next would not be loud, would not be forced, but it would be undeniable, the kind of truth that did not need to be shouted to be heard. Morning came slow over Red Hollow, the kind of morning that did not rush itself, pale light stretching across the land inch by inch, revealing what had always been there without asking permission, and Ethan Cole stood at the edge of his porch watching it unfold, his arms resting loosely at his sides, his eyes fixed on the road that led into town, knowing before he saw her that Ayana had already made her decision long before the sun rose. She stepped off the porch without a word, her movements quiet, deliberate, the necklace resting against her throat where both markings now caught the early light, not hidden, not softened, but visible in a way that did not ask for approval, and Ethan did not stop her, did not offer to go, did not try to shape what came next, because he understood now that this was not his place to lead, only to witness. The distance between the cabin and the town felt shorter that morning, not because the land had changed, but because the weight of what was being carried across it had shifted, no longer something buried, no longer something concealed, but something walking openly under the sky, steady and unafraid. By the time they reached the first line of buildings, the town was already awake, doors opening, voices rising, the ordinary rhythm of a place settling into itself. But it did not take long for that rhythm to falter, for eyes to turn, for conversations to slow, because people noticed what did not fit before they noticed what did, and Ayana walking down the main street, alive, visible, wearing the same necklace that had been placed in the ground the day before, did not fit any version of the story they had agreed upon. No one spoke at first, not loudly, not directly, but the silence that followed her was not empty. It was full of recognition, of confusion, of something deeper that people did not yet have words for, and Ethan walked a few steps behind, not beside her, not ahead, just close enough to be there, his presence quiet, unintrusive, the way a man stands when he knows the moment does not belong to him. They stopped in front of the sheriff's office, the same door, the same lantern now unlit in the morning light. And for a moment, nothing happened, just the two of them standing there while the town gathered in small, hesitant clusters along the edges of the street, watching without stepping forward, listening without speaking. Ayanna did not knock. She did not hesitate. She simply stepped onto the porch and opened the door, the wood creaking softly as it had the night before, and walked inside as if she had every right to be there, which, in a way the town had tried to forget, she did. Ethan remained outside, leaning lightly against the post, his gaze steady, not scanning the crowd, not reacting to the quiet murmurs that had begun to rise, because he understood that whatever was about to happen inside that room did not need a witness in every corner. It only needed one truth spoken where it had been denied. The minutes stretched, slow, deliberate, the kind that seemed longer than they were, and then the door opened again, and Ayanna stepped back out, her posture unchanged, her expression the same calm certainty it had always been. But behind her, Sheriff Dalton Briggs stood in the doorway, his face composed, his eyes scanning the gathered townspeople, and for the first time since Ethan had known him, there was something in his stance that was not entirely steady, not weakness, not fear, but the recognition that something had shifted beyond his control. No announcement was made. No speech was given. Ayanna did not raise her voice, did not explain, did not argue. She simply stood there, one hand resting lightly at her side, the other brushing the necklace at her throat, and in that simple, quiet gesture, she did what no words could have done. She showed them both names, both markings, both truths existing at once, impossible to ignore, impossible to deny without first denying what they could see with their own eyes. The crowd did not react all at once, not with noise, not with outrage, but with something slower, something heavier, a kind of stillness that spread from one person to the next, as if each of them was waiting for someone else to speak first and finding that no one could. Ethan watched from the porch, his arms still, his expression unreadable, but inside, he felt that same shift settle deeper, the understanding that this was what quiet justice looked like out here, not loud, not forced, but undeniable in its presence. Ayanna turned then, not toward the sheriff, not toward the crowd, but toward the open street, and without another word, she stepped down from the porch and walked forward, past the people who had once agreed she no longer existed, past the buildings that had stood on land tied to a name they had tried to erase. And as she moved, no one stopped her, no one spoke, no one reached out, because the truth she carried did not need permission to pass through them. Ethan pushed off the post and followed at a distance, the morning light growing stronger, the town behind them quiet in a way it had never been before, not because nothing had happened, but because something had, something that could not be undone, something that would remain long after the dust settled and the voices returned, the kind of change that did not announce itself, but stayed, steady and unshaken, like the land itself. By the time the sun climbed higher over Red Hollow, the town had found its voice again, but it was not the same voice it had carried the day before, not as certain, not as quick to settle into the comfort of its own version of things, and Ethan Cole stood at the edge of the street, watching as life resumed in small, careful steps, doors opening a little slower, conversations beginning with glances instead of words, as if everyone was measuring what could still be said without breaking something that had quietly shifted. Ayanna did not stop in the center of town, did not linger where the silence had followed her. She kept walking, steady, unhurried, the necklace resting against her throat catching the light with every step, both markings visible now, not competing, not hiding, simply existing together in a way that could not be undone. When she reached the far end of the street, where the buildings gave way to open land again, she paused, not because she needed to, but because there was something left to finish, something small, something that did not require witnesses, but would be seen anyway. Ethan remained where he was, not moving closer, not calling out, because he understood that whatever she was about to do was not for him, and not for the town, but for something that had begun long before either of them had stepped into it. Ayanna reached up slowly, her fingers finding the necklace, lifting it just enough to turn it in the light, and for a moment, the silver seemed to hold both names in equal weight, the one carved first, worn but still present, and the one added later, sharper, newer, but no longer dominant. She studied it briefly, not with hesitation, not with doubt, but with a quiet understanding that felt complete, then lowered it back against her skin, not adjusting it to hide either marking, not choosing one over the other, simply letting it rest as it was, a truth that had survived being changed and refused to disappear. The wind moved across the open land again, carrying with it the faint sounds of the town behind her, voices returning, footsteps resuming, but none of it reached her in a way that mattered, because the choice she had made did not depend on what followed. Ethan watched her from a distance, his arms loose at his sides, his expression calm, and in that moment, he realized that nothing had been taken back, nothing had been forced, nothing had been corrected in the way most people would expect, and yet everything had changed. The grave still existed beyond the ridge, the name they had buried still written somewhere in the town's records, the agreements still intact on paper, but none of it held the same weight anymore, because the truth was no longer hidden. It was walking, breathing, standing in the open without asking to be believed. Ayanna stepped forward again, leaving the last building behind, moving out into the wide stretch of land that had always belonged to more than one story. And she did not look back, not at the town, not at the people who had watched her walk through their silence, because she did not need to see whether they understood, only that she had not allowed herself to be erased. Ethan remained where he was for a long moment after she disappeared into the distance, the outline of her figure growing smaller against the horizon until it blended with the land itself. And only then did he turn, his gaze drifting back toward the town, toward the same streets, the same buildings, the same people, but nothing quite fit the same way anymore. A man stepped out from the general store, paused, then looked down the road where she had gone, his expression unreadable, and another followed. Then another, not speaking, not calling out, just looking, as if something in them had been quietly unsettled in a way they could not yet name. Ethan walked slowly back toward his horse, the sound of his boots steady against the dirt, and as he mounted, he glanced once more toward the ridge where the shallow grave lay, the place where they had tried to end something by placing it out of sight, and he understood now that the ground did not keep what did not belong to it, not forever. He turned the horse toward his cabin, the mile of open land stretching ahead, the wind moving steady at his back, and for the first time since this had begun, his thoughts felt quiet again, not because the questions were gone, but because the answers no longer needed to be forced into place. Behind him, Red Hollow continued, its people returning to their routines, its doors opening and closing, its voices rising. Again, but somewhere beneath all of that, something had shifted, something that would not easily settle back into what it had been, the kind of change that did not demand attention but stayed, steady and present, like a mark that could not be fully erased no matter how many times it was covered. And out beyond the last line of buildings, where the land stretched wide and unclaimed by any one story, a woman walked with her name resting where it belonged, not spoken, not argued, simply carried, and in that quiet, unbroken way, it remained.